Hi, look, I just opened it. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sharing it again. Yeah.
Rajnikant. So I'll just move whether we have a picture of Rajnikant at the back, right?
Okay. Oh, nice.
So the entire lounge is the theme Rajnikant. It's one of the biggest attractions, that we have in the research part.
Yeah. I mean, he's the king of imagination, right? So.
Right.
You have replaced Rajnikant for now. Have you replaced Rajnikant for now?
No. He's superstar. Nobody can replace him.
No offense. No offense.
Okay, so should we get started? I guess a few other people will trickle in. We don't expect a very large audience, but it'll be a nice compact audience. Professor Tillai, do you want to get us started here?
Yeah, sure. Okay. And so welcome and good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you all for this panel discussion. And this panel discussion is going to be the first, what we would call as a public event of this consortium that we have established recently. So this would be the Innovation, Venturing and Entrepreneurship in India Network. And so this is a consortium that consists of the following institutes as members: IIT Madras, IIT Bombay, IIM Bangalore, IIM Calcutta, and IIM Kozhikode. India has today become the epicenter of startups, right? I mean, and depending on which statistics that we look at, we are either the number 3 or number 4 in terms of startups and the associated ecosystem that accompanies the startup. And predominantly, we have been driven by policy and practice. And the objective of this consortium is to really provide academic and thought leadership to this very, very important segment in today's economy. And this association itself will be doing several activities. One is to be able to come out with the biennial report on the Indian innovation and venturing ecosystem. The second is to organize academic conferences as we go. Third is general special issues, which is more. So this panel discussion that we have today, this is the first public event I just mentioned before, and this panel discussion is also going to be featured in the forthcoming India Innovation and Venturing report. And I would like to thank all of you for being a part of this. And I'm sure, given the profile of the panelists, we'll have an extremely interesting and, more importantly, very engaging discussion. And without any further ado, I'll introduce Vardhini. Professor Srivardhini is a faculty at IIM Bangalore. She will be the moderator for this panel discussion. Professor Srivardhani is also an editor for the annual report, and after being, she's basically the real heart of startup ecosystem, spending time in Stanford earlier, and I'm sure we can't find a better person to anchor and moderate this panel discussion today. So welcome you all, and over to you, Vardhini.
Thank you, Professor Tillai, for that flattering introduction. So I want to just, just set the stage, if you will, before we jump into the panel discussion. First of all, let me begin by introducing all our panelists, right? So we have Professor Satya Chakravarti. He's a professor in the Department of Aerospace Engineering at IIT Madras. He's co-founder and mentor to many aerospace startups. He's coordinating the National Center for Combustion Research and Development established by the Department of Science and Technology, Government of India. And he's also at the helm of things at the Center of Propulsion Technologies that's being established with the support of DRDO. He has, of course, is extensively published in international journals and has many conference presentations to his credit. He has also won several distinguished awards, including the DRDO Academic Excellence Award in 2009, the Dalmia et al. Award in High Energy Materials in 2010, and several others. So we are very privileged to have him here with us today on this panel, representing the aerospace, the space tech sector. Then we have Professor Dr. Taslim Arif Saeed. His initial training has been in neurosciences, where he received his PhD from Max Planck Institute for Brain Research in Germany, and he followed it up by postdoctoral training at University of California at San Francisco. He also underwent training in management for biotech and innovation at Santa Cruz, UC Berkeley, and UC San Francisco. He has also completed a biotech management program for biotech executives at Wharton School. In the Bay Area, he has served as a management consultant, and he now heads the Discovery to Innovation Accelerator Program at CCAMP. CCAMP is the Center for Cellular and Molecular Platforms. He's actively involved in promoting innovation in the life science healthcare by supporting translation of discoveries to application. He's also an adjunct faculty at IIT Madras and also at Amrita Institute School of Biotechnology. So a very warm welcome to Dr. Saeed. And last but not the least, we have Umakant Soni, who is an IIT Kanpur alum. He has several patents under his belt. He's the co-founder of AI Foundry and Art Park, which is AI and Robotics Technology Park, which is being built in partnership with Indian Institute of Science. The aim of this is to build an AI mothership for 6 billion users. He is also India's nominated expert for Innovation and Commercialization Working Group, Global Partnership on AI. Umakant has extensive entrepreneurship experience. He's been an entrepreneur himself. He co-founded India's first AI fund as well, Pi Ventures, and backed some of the most well-known AI companies in India, SigTuple, Niramai, and others. He was the CEO and co-founder of AI Bot, startup Vimagino, and has also served as a consultant in the strategy for advanced technology and innovation arm at Wipro. So a very warm welcome to Umakant as well. So as you can tell, we have a fantastic panel. Space tech represented by Professor Satya. We have biosciences represented by Dr. Taslim, and Umakant representing the AI ML space. So with that introduction, I want to just now dive into the discussion itself, but a couple of things before that. We will have a Q&A session towards the end, maybe about 15-20 minutes. In the meantime, if you have any questions, there is a Q&A option on your screens right at the bottom. So please put in your questions there, so that will help us look at the emerging themes and conduct the Q&A session in a more efficient manner. So as and when you have questions, feel free to park them in that Q&A session. So the panel discussion itself will go on for about 60 minutes, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. That's the plan. Now, we define deep tech as technology that is based on tangible engineering innovation or scientific advances and discovery. So that's sort of the fairly well-established definition of deep tech, right? Which is having a base in scientific advancement and discoveries and engineering innovation. So with that as sort of the ground, we will dive into the questions right away. And we will sort of, not exactly a rapid fire format, but I will pose a question and ask each of our panelists to sort of give their responses in about 2 to 3 minutes. So we'll hopefully in an hour's time cover about 7 questions. That's the plan, okay? So to start off with, just to make this discussion concrete for all of us and for the audience, Can you all, each of you, talk about 2 or 3 emergent, exciting applications in your respective areas? So Professor Satya, may I ask you to please kick this off?
Sure. I think I'm probably among the panelists that we have. I'm maybe oversimplifying, but definitely the kind of work that we do cannot be done on a tabletop, right? So we definitely do something much bigger, probably the size of a human being or more. So this is really hardware tech. What I find is there are basically 2 things that is the drivers today. One is 3D printing, all the way to getting metal 3D printing of different alloys, very exotic high temperature with alloys, and so on. That is a game changer. That facilitates prototyping on the one side significantly, almost to the real level of performance that you need to expect, and then you can tinker with changes, do the next prototype very quickly, and so on. Because otherwise, you will have to make molds every time and cast them or whatever, or do sheet metal work. All of that stuff just completely goes out of the window when you now try to do 3D printing. But in fact, in some cases like rockets, even though they are expendable rockets, and of course there is a lot of effort on trying to recover those rockets and bring down the costs significantly even further than what we are doing right now. It is possible for us to actually use these actual 3D printed hardware in flight. So many times we have this tendency to think that 3D printing is actually good for prototyping, but the final, the full-scale manufacturing, when you set up a factory and so on, you will have to probably get back to conventional methods for bringing down the production costs. But in the case of things like rockets, you could 3D printing is good to go all the way to the final product that will fly. So that is and that's what we believe will make rockets being built on demand for any satellite without any waiting time for the satellite to meet. As soon as the order is placed on the rocket, the 3D printers can get to their work, and we can assemble a rocket in about, each rocket motor can be made in about 2 days at the current level of printing. But let's say you have to put a bunch of motors together to make a stage and then have multiple stages. We expect that a rocket can be built within a week or 2 and good to go for launch. So this is the kind of rapid development that we are looking at with 3D printing. The second thing that's happening is electrification. So pretty much everything that we are actually looking at is getting electrified. Anything that needs to move is actually getting electrified. Smaller items of movement like bots and so on being electrified is not a big deal. But we are now talking about going all the way to aircraft, becoming electric aircraft. The idea of having electric rockets is still a bit of an infancy at the moment. Rockets are typically brute force machines. You need to push a lot of gas out of the rocket and stuff. That's difficult with electric, but we are still doing electric pumps, electric motor powered pumps that are actually drawing the propellant and pushing it into the combustion chamber. So there you have electrification, batteries, all of that stuff coming in. So these are the 2 major emergent technologies that are disrupting the scenario here.
Fantastic. Umakant, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think, Professor Chakravarti just talked about, I think, one of the innovations being backed by Pi as well, Pi Ventures as well, right? I think really cool. And it's fantastic that, we are here talking about it. So that gives a flavor. Coming from AI and robotics area, we backed a company called Nirmay as part of Pi Ventures. They are applying, a completely new way to screen for breast cancer using thermal images and applying AI over that. And it was very interesting to see that, because what we found was that, when you are actually having the traditional ways of going for breast cancer screening, you're actually testing for lump, which is the density, right? But what Nirmay does is that they check for abnormal blood flow right? And this is a completely different approach. So I think one thing that I would love to talk about is the leapfrog approach to innovation that some of these products are actually, taking. Another company that we have bagged, it's called Karma Life. So Karma Life is an interesting company. We are going after the gig workers who probably don't have any assets except their data asset. I mean, they have their cell phone or smartphone to prove that they are a good, reliable, credit borrower, right? I mean, they are a good borrower, and they mirror 200 plus million people in India who actually have no asset, right? And for them, it's actually a very tough to get into the whole credit regime. So they have bank accounts, but none of the banking products are built for them because all banks want is tangible assets to lend to them, right? So this is something that we said, okay, we need to back this innovation. So they actually have 9 sensors in mobile phone, and through that they're actually tracking data. So they built a complete, data acquisition platform which collects data from across these 9 sensors, and it integrates with their work data, with the financial data, with the personal data and the social data, right? And it's a completely revolutionary way to look at how to give credit to people who actually have no access to credit. So today, the challenge is that people who have no formal access to credit, they're getting credit at 5% interest per month, right? That is very difficult for a seasoned investor to envision in some of our ventures, right? And so they would be probably perpetually in this, debt trap, if you were to see that. Another company that is kind of interesting to talk about here, we're just starting to tinker with it and think about, is that whole space of healthcare. I think we invested in this company called Sigtuple, which is applying AI to pathology. And what they do is that they actually scan the blood slides using deep learning, computer vision, and now they have GPU on the device itself, and they can tell you whether you should go into hospital or you should stay out of the hospital in case you have dengue, right? In 5 minutes, right? So what we are seeing is that there is a whole bunch of new innovations that are coming through, which are made possible by advances in not just software, which is the AI and deep learning is coming at, but also the hardware. So the hardware and software both are moving together, and that actually I feel is going to be the basis of next 15 years of hyper innovation, where you will have both of these layers moving and also the business model layer moving, and them combining to create extraordinary financial and societal outcomes.
That's great to hear. So fintech, healthcare, lots of areas, exciting areas there. Dr. Taslim, do you want to go next?
Surely. Great to be here. Thanks, both Shrodhi and Thalai, for the invite. I think life science, I can share very quickly, has very exciting deep tech or deep science stuff happening in broadly, and something that is badly needed as we see today. But in general too, I think the deep science innovations have taken a very interesting stuff, and something from CCAM, if I may share. Let me relate it to the right now, that the broad issues of building science-based innovations, which are important in responding to pandemics like that, are very crucial, and how some of those innovations have actually made it to the deployment and being able to serve the society is very, very crucial. And that has been possible because there has been a surge of science-based innovations for the last 8 to 10 years. If you didn't have the ground up, you wouldn't be able to respond. So there was some activity which has been able to respond. So some of the work that has come up, like we have now technologies which actually can prevent one of the most fatal conditions, like ICU conditions, like ventilator-associated pneumonia, which happens at very large stage in ICU settings where patient is on ventilator for some other reason, of course, but acquires infection and gets into pneumonia while on ventilator, which actually really manyfold increase the chance of non-survival, and more so in old age. We have a technology which has been there and now US FDA approved, through a company called Inexcel/Koyo Labs, which actually prevents for in this infections and occurrence of pneumonia in ICU patients. As it's already on the ground in Karnataka, in many other states. So this is really phenomenal. You are actually saving lives right there, and that is right from here. And not many such technologies are actually across the world around. They have been in Mass Gen competition top 50 technologies of the world. So that's one. We also have something that completely, as I think yesterday I was talking to somebody, while we talk about COVID, and we'll stay with healthcare, but I would love to go to agri and other aspects later on. As we talk about COVID, what is the challenge of the COVID? The COVID's challenge is that we do not have a drug, simple, or a vaccine, right? There is nothing. So what is the challenge? We do not have a drug, we do not have a vaccine. Hence, the issue is that how do we save lives? Similar, much bigger challenge is in front of us. There's a phenomena called antimicrobial resistance, where you will have bacteria, like COVID is for a virus, but we will not have a drug for them. And that is not around the corner, it is here. Just the scale is actually not visible. So in every hospital that there are bugs which are non-treatable, and we are losing lives to them. It's just that they are not as infectious and airborne as COVID, but they are going to grow. They are going to give many people. So there is a company right here, which is actually over last 8 years, trying to build drug for such gram-negative bacteria, which actually do not have any drug for now. So just to give you a perspective, gram-negative bacteria, last time the antibiotic was built was early 1960s ever in the world. After that, there is no gram-negative bacteria drug has come out in a way, new one, completely new one. But bacteria have grown, they have evolved, they have learned to live in difficult conditions. And now genetically, they are modified to respond to and take care of drugs. They don't care about drugs. So that's going to be a huge, another healthcare challenge that we are facing. And to have a company right from here in Bangalore, which is funded by US government BARDA's program for around 9 million and Japan VC funds, twice around 8 million or something, and near phase 1 is actually a story in the making. It actually shows that if you have good scientific roots, you can build, you can take on larger challenges. Of course, these are the 2 or 3 I can add on. But what I was trying to say is that there are interesting stories emerging, but the more risk needs to be taken, more belief has to be built in science. We will have more failure rates compared to other fields. It will be 10 times more failure rates. But if we don't invest in science, we will not have the outcomes that we are looking for. We will always be adopters. We will always be importers of innovations. We will not be actually generators of those. So I think I would say that this panel is very important to insist on that how we need to actually invest in deep science innovations, knowing that there will be a very large number of failures also on the road.
Right, right. No, that's fantastic. And it's very nice to sort of ground all of this discussion with concrete examples and what's actually happening out there in the field. And it's very heartening to see that we have some very interesting technologies and very exciting companies right here in our backyard. So Tasleem's comments actually lead me very nicely to my next question, which is, then what are the unique challenges? So we all understand what is deep tech and why it is so important. Now let's discuss about what are the unique challenges that deep tech startups face vis-a-vis other startups, right? And how can, if you are an entrepreneur, if one is an entrepreneur who is tackling this, how do you deal with these challenges? More from an entrepreneur's perspective. We'll talk about the ecosystem later. So what are the unique challenges that one would face as a deep tech entrepreneur, and how do you tackle these challenges?
Who goes
Anybody can go first.
Sure. I would.
Yeah, please.
So, I would just completely talk from my own experience. As an entrepreneur, we're trying to build chatbots in 2009-10 when Siri wasn't famous. Siri was also a startup, in Valley, and so there are 3 things which we realized that it was very difficult to do it in India. One is that, of course, we actually went to all the research institutes in India who actually had a machine learning group, and we tried to talk to them. And unfortunately, at that point of time, startup orientation was not there in 2009-10 I'm talking about. I think that is changing now, but it wasn't there, and it was very hard because without that innovation ecosystem, it's very hard to build deep tech companies because you would need that sustained knowledge that comes from chasing an area for maybe 10, 15 years. So you need that, foundation. The second big challenge that I saw as a deep tech entrepreneur was that, ability to get early customers to believe in us. I think in 2009-10, chatbots were very, very, very unknown, especially in India. I remember we were going to one of the large telecom companies' office, and we waited for 4 hours to tell them our story. And at the end of it, they said that, yeah, but you should get it. Nobody is, applying it in US, right? So why should we adopt it, right? So lack of early visionary customers was a problem then. But I think there also now the situation is changing, right? Now you are actually seeing a lot of these sectors open up. In fact, some of the startups that we have funded, they were actually able to sell their products in India. So I think that part is changing. But as a deep tech startup entrepreneur, I think you need to work really hard to find those early believers in you, right? The third thing, of course, was the funding ecosystem, because deep tech, requires proofing of science and then proofing of tech. And that could mean 4 years will go by, right? So, I mean, who are the really interesting investors who could think, on a long-term perspective? Those are limited, in my view, in India right now. I think we're trying to address it by, one of the big initiative which is there from Government of India, which is about the whole AI research and innovation ecosystem through two massive missions. One is getting rolled out by DST, another by NITI and MeitY. That might change, but I think, yeah, these are three challenging things to solve when you are actually a deep tech.
Okay. Professor Satya, would you like to add to that?
I think the single most problem that we face is time to market in deep tech. It takes a long time for us to be able to actually start from ideation all the way to market, and requires some amount of time for us to be able to bootstrap before some people can actually begin to believe in what you're trying to do. There are several ways by which you can make them believe in your journey. One is probably show subscale prototypes that work, or you show some early milestones that are showing the proof of concept and so on. But that might have to be bootstrapped. So you need to have some cash with you to begin with. That's like a hurdle to cross. And if you have a, let's say, a subscale prototype, people will start asking, why can't you actually commercialize that? And that's a problem, because I can either commercialize that, or I can actually go and build a full scale, right? So I may not have the bandwidth to do both. And if I say I can actually do both, they won't believe me either, right? So, so you're kind of stuck trying to do too many things, but you need to focus, otherwise it's difficult. So there is really no good template for this. And a lot of investors also tend to actually slot you into saying, when is your Series A happening? When is your Series? I don't even know what is Series. I mean, I have to get my product up, right? So, so these kinds of templates that are based on these typical e-commerce startups and all that stuff really hurts deep tech. I think we need to have a completely different mindset about it.
So if I could quickly interject with another follow-up question, because you made this interesting tension, right? Which is, do I commercialize what I have, or do I build a product that can scale, right? To scale. So how do you snap out of this sort of tension in your own experience?
That's an extremely good question, because a typical entrepreneurial gut feeling should be, I should actually go to market with what I can quickly get done. Yeah. All right. That said, for example, I mean, in rockets, there is nothing like a small rocket, because if you have to go to orbit, right, you need to have something big, right, minimum, right? So in fact, what Agnikul is trying to do is, it's very interesting what Agnikul is trying to do and compared to a lot of other startups. So it's easy for you to actually make a rocket that takes 100 kgs to orbit And then you can now make a bigger rocket than that by actually strapping more boosters together and then take the 300 kg or the 500 kg. But for us, we actually want to prove 100 kg and then see if it's possible to downsize that rocket to take something like 30 kg. Right, and so that we will be able to offer the same price point on a per kg basis to the customer, so that the cost curve is actually flat on a per kg basis. That's actually difficult, right? So your first product itself has to be somewhat like a minimum bigness to it. It has to have, that's one problem. The second problem is, what is the kind of impact you're going to have? Let's say, for example, I take the example of E-plane. We do have subscale prototypes that can take cargo, and strictly speaking, a lot of cargo actually moves around when compared to people moving around. And it's possible that people can actually not move around anymore. We can do online. A cargo cannot do online with each other. Okay, so they have to actually move. So it's possible that cargo market is actually a bigger market than the people market. But what about the vision, the dream on the impact that we are trying to make in people's lives and all of that stuff? Does an investor care about that? We need to figure out that particular investor who cares about it, that actually is passionate about the dream just as we are, and so on, so that they will be able to actually see the vision on making people carrying planes, and not get stuck and say just take cargo and pizza and whatever it is. Yeah, so there are a few different elements to the whole thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would just second that. I think, and I use this popular analogy, right? Like, if I need to get a baby out, if I feed more food to mother, the baby won't come out in 5 months. It's still going to take 9 months, and that actually is a real challenge, because this whole lean startup methodology doesn't work in deep tech startups. And actually, would love to actually one day write a blog post about it, because so many entrepreneurs actually end up destroying their own startup because they, get into this perspective of MVP and, I mean, building a mobile app is very different because your hardware, software stack is stable, right? When your hardware stack, software stack, or whatever deep tech stack that you are trying to do is moving, you will not get an MVP out in 3 months or 3 weeks. You cannot show 10% month-on-month growth that Y Combinator demands. No, that is not possible. You're probably, selling either, even if you're raising money, you're probably selling wrong expectation to investors. And that's the challenge, because we need to develop this whole ecosystem for deep tech innovation. We don't have, I mean, that's the frank answer if I were to probably summarize. Yeah, we don't have.
I just want to make a very quick point to add on to that. In deep tech, the problem is we don't have, particularly the ones that we do, like rockets and planes and stuff, we don't have a choice of failure. So if for example, the Zoom call that we are doing, or the Google Meet or Microsoft Teams, all of these things can fail and nothing happens, right? So, I mean, without attracting a defamation suit, I can clearly say that, Sundar Pichai or Tim Cook or Satya Nadella can actually make really lousy products and get away with it, right? We can't, right? And we are just a startup, not known at all. How do we cope up with this situation?
Yeah, a very fair point, and I think it's very applicable to the biosciences, the life sciences space in particular. Taslim, do you want to come in on this?
Shivani, would you like to? So, if I may just add, I think let me just possibly continue in the same breath and put the tech aspect. So, when there is no doubt in my mind that the tech and healthcare has a phenomenal convergence potential. I think there's absolutely no doubt, and India needs it and can conquer it. Both are there. Needs it is something that, okay, we can't do. There is a need because we are not serving a larger population, where 30% of our population is not served well in terms of healthcare. So we need it. The second is that, can we conquer it? There are several considerations before we can conquer it, but there is a potential. Now, coming back, India has seen a few early healthcare startups, health tech startups, right? What has happened? We should see it a bit carefully. In some of the startups, what has happened is that while there has been a phenomenal growth, but because of the complexity of the healthcare system, they haven't been able to position themselves very clearly. Our healthcare system is very, very complex. You know, the healthcare is a state subject. We have different kind of players in it. The reimbursement is a different play. Government is a different play. Primary healthcare is a different play. Prevention is a different aspect. It's completely difficult. On top of it, you bring in the regulatory aspect, which is makes you take every complexity and multiply by some fold. So you are actually sitting on top of black boxes after black boxes, and then to bring a new technology and try to position it has been very, very difficult for them. And that's where I think you require very clear long-term approach and not necessarily look at the health tech company as another tech company. I see somewhere, I think people take the same approach when they look at the health tech company, they look at the tech company, and they want to push it the same way, including many stakeholders which are a part of it. I think this is where we could differentiate. We should look at health tech company as a long-term haul, not in a 2 years, a revenue generating, profit making, this much valuation. Rather, we should look at it as something that, do you think those products would come to market? Do you think the revenues will generate? Do you think the same technology can be useful for other established players, like through a joint development, like a licensing thing and so on? And that is very, very important. It is true for digital health in terms of the, you can say the diagnostics, but there are also many other aspects of digital health, which looks at the early, engagement with rural areas, early engagement with other aspects. So I think very high potential, badly needed, but we need to understand that we should treat this baby differently than the baby that we have taken care of for last few years. I would just say that.
No, those are some very, very interesting insights. So if I might just quickly summarize what we are hearing you say, that what works for a regular tech startup or software technology startup in terms of mindset, in terms of process, doesn't work in the deep tech space, right? I mean, whether it is application of the lean startup methodology, it's just the mindset of having a longer runway and a longer vision actually of what you want to accomplish with this science. It's very different, and it takes a very different approach. Now, given that we have established that this is very different, now what are the catalytic factors that we need? I mean, from an ecosystem perspective, what is it that we need to have a vibrant deep tech startup ecosystem? I mean, if we were to look at Israel, if we have to look at Silicon Valley or Boston, what is it? Not to compare ourselves with Silicon Valley and Boston. I know that we are not the same, we are different. But what does it take for us to become a vibrant deep tech ecosystem? What are our strengths? I mean, where are we doing well, and what are some of the gaps? And maybe Taslim, you could start this time.
Surely, I think that's a good question, and these are early thoughts, not necessarily the answers per se. But I would say that in terms of building a real solid thing, what we need is a critical mass of deep tech. We cannot have a few occurrence of deep tech here and there. We need critical mass at one place and such clusters across. Bangalore is definitely emerging one, and there are many others as well. I will not discount them, but we need, within Bangalore, we need solid critical mass of deep tech work being happening around, possibly, if I may say so, even academic places like IISs of the world, like our place of the world, JNCHR, and so on. And that has to combine, and something that is, I would say, absolutely topmost priority. We need to have a phenomenally porous, the system to actually have the new startups, the new enterprises talking to the profs of the IISs of the world on daily basis. They should be sharing the same cafeteria. They should be sharing the same corridor and bumping into each other in some manner. That has happened possibly a little bit with, if I'm not wrong, with IIT Madras Research Park. At least the proximity has been set up. We need to do more of it at multiple places, and I think that is absolutely right. But while we do that, I think for whatever reasons we haven't seen at multiple places other than the IIT Madras Research Park. So that is one. The second thing that we definitely need to do in terms of larger ecosystem is that we need to also ensure that the work that is being done, one of the things that we face is right now is that last few years, there has been good support for early proof of concept studies for deep tech or deep science. That is good. So like, oh, you have an idea? Here you go. This is a small amount, take it. Now, and that has been largely driven by government support. So that's good. Once they achieve that, and as I mentioned, in deep tech and in science, it's a long journey. So risk doesn't get mitigated very early. It is a long haul. And I think just like I think Satyanarayana just mentioned, it is not that it has a larger impact. So the risk remains until it goes to the product stage, right? So until you go, the risk is there. But once proof of concept is achieved, the stakes are high, the investments are high, and government cannot come in every time. Now you need investors from other areas, including private investors. And that's where risk is there. We need more investors to actually come and take it. The challenge remains the same, that I think ecosystem hasn't grown for risk funding as much. And I think we all know that. I think there's no running away from that. The reason is that if you're going to do 10 very high risk, 9 is going to go by, and only 1 will give you something out of after 5 years or 7 years. So I think, but now if you don't have the risk funding, what is happening? They are all stagnated after proof of concept. Then they struggle, then they do pivot because something else is easier. They kind of do service, they kind of do in here, they kind of do just a survival mode. The dreams that I think we heard about actually start coming down and say, okay, no, I need to survive right now, so let me do that. So deep tech slowly becomes whatever tech, right? And then that's where the story is happening. So I think we need to, and we have put this in front of several central government agencies, including the top-notch agency, to say that we need deep tech fund in a way to actually ensure that after good science has been tested, good tech has been tested, for its further journey, there has to be some, if I may say so, subsidy for investors to come in and actually support that. Israel, actually, the example you said, actually has done it. 1-to-1 investment or something other that they have done it, $1 to $1. We do need it in deep science, deep tech, and go further. So I think those 2 points, I think I would put at the top from my side to enable to build such an ecosystem.
Professor Satya?
Yeah, I think I believe I do have a fairly good answer to the question that you asked. And the reason is, I would encourage anybody to actually, after the pandemic is over and movements are restored very well, to visit NCCRD that we have. The NCCRD was originally conceived as an R&D center for combustion in many different areas like automobiles, thermal power, propulsion and stuff, but it's in the last few years it has actually transformed into a hub of deep tech startups that's making rockets, planes, engines, and a lot of other things. So we actually have looked around the world to find out if there is anything like what we are doing, and we found no, we are the only ones who are doing something like this, right? So an incubator or an accelerator, none of these things actually seem to be sufficient for fostering deep tech. So for example, a very miniature version of what we have in IIT Madras is the Center for Innovation, C5, where a lot of undergraduates spend enormous amount of their time tinkering. So it's essentially like a tinkering lab with the slogan, walk in with an idea, walk out with a product, right? So at the end of it, they come with a product, all right, but the product is sort of like a, what should I say, rickety one, right? Now, that cannot be commercially viable. You need to have a very solid, very well-engineered product with some innovation involved, some IP, all of that stuff. So there is some R&D that's going into it and some new things about it and so on. That is one. Second, you need to also make sure that it is commercially viable. So the cost of making it versus what is the market for it and what people are willing to pay for, what are you trying, which is the pain point you're trying to solve. All of these things have to be worked out. The third is, are you legal to do whatever you're trying to do? Because most of this deep tech that we do, for example, when we started making rockets, the question of whether we are actually allowed to launch a rocket other than ISRO was not there. In fact, many times I've even publicly thanked the investors for putting in faith in these kinds of things, because I have personally actually sat across with a very eminent lawyer asking this question, and she told me right into my eyes that I'll be behind bars if I did it. Okay, so it's very scary. Okay, so is there a way by which we can now have a center that has all the physical infrastructure in terms of machines, very high-tech machines like metal 3D printers, electron beam welding, all of that huge amount of infrastructure for manufacturing, so that prototyping can be done just like that, and you can accelerate the process of the product development on the one hand, but you also have the intellectual infrastructure of a chief business officer, chief technology officer, a CEO, COO, all those guys taking care of running the show of the center, as well as also getting into the nitty-gritties of the business and look at the legalities of it. What is the current level of regulations that exist? What regulations have to change? How is it possible for us to actually have policy documents that can be put out that influences legislation to change those regulations? Everything has to be done from these kinds of places. So the check size is 75 to 100 crores. Give me one, I'll show you exactly how to do this. We're already doing this with much less money, with no structure, but there is a structure in our minds on how to exactly put this to happen. And free to help people set this up as well. Not a problem.
Great. Umakant?
Yeah, I think what you're asking for is what is deep tech utopia in some sense, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think the closest, so I mean, we did study what's actually happening in Israel, Canada, and China. So it's not, you know, the problem solution is not really rocket science. I think, as Professor Satya described, right? It is doable. It is very much possible. I think what we need to do in a summary, we need to create this idea to impact innovation engine. And I think, you know, for a long time we've been doing jugaad.
Okay, I think.
Jugaad has become the, you know, selective word right now.
Okay, I think we lost Umakant
Right.
there. Let's just give him a few seconds.
Looks like he dropped out. Yeah.
Okay, so we will keep the conversation moving, and once he comes back. So it seems like, you know, picking up on what you all were saying about funding being a major bottleneck here, right? So what could be some innovative funding models? Because clearly, you know, Taslim, you were saying how there's enough money for prototypes. Usually the government gives out something, right? Go build a prototype. Now that's done. But then if you have to take it to full scale commercialization, where will that money come? And I think part of the problem is also the life cycle of a venture capital fund does not quite align with the, you know, life cycle of a deep tech venture. So in this case, it seems like we need some innovations in the funding model itself. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think absolutely. There are two versions one could look at, as I mentioned. There has been some movement from current exciting VC players to actually look into this. But what they would have to do is that they would have to go back to their LP, show phenomenal portfolio that they have, and make a case for risk funding, because the current VC funds which are running were not built or meant for such alignment of aspect of the long gestation. So that's clear. So they already had the fund. They couldn't pivot the fund per se and do that while they are trying to do it. So there has been but of course there's another thing that we as people who are keen on pushing it is to keep mentioning is that there would be failures. So please take failures into account already, and then let's do it. If we fund two and both of them do not do well, that doesn't mean your deep tech would never work, and do not just come back out of it. So early water testing, we have to be very, very patient, and we'll have to work with them. So we'll have to give cushion to them in a way in that. And how do we provide them a cushion is to bring in both state level machinery as well as the federal machinery to to be able to provide that cushion. And I think those cushion things have to be done. There have been many attempts like that where people have built fund of funds, people have built dedicated funds where this guy can join and they can do together. But I think we have to do it for deep tech. I think that is not there currently. That is no dedicated risk fund that we need to do, which is very, very important. Plus a subsidized capability, tax aspect and so on, that the government can bring in for these funds that could actually help us. And we will have to do it for possibly 5 to 10 years. And many geographies have done it, as we know. They have implemented for 5 to 10 years. And by the time the stakeholders, the funders have gotten used to the style of funding, the style of the risk, and so on. So once they get used to it and when they are able to work with it, then those relaxations can actually slowly taper out. So I would say that for now.
So in some way, it's almost a public-private partnership towards funding deep tech startups.
Indeed. I think government's role, according to me, the simple definition is that when private players do not come, I think government has to intervene. I think that's a very important thing. So government's role should actually be intervene where private players are hesitant to come, make that happen, and then once private players are in, you come out of it. So that's precisely it.
Yeah. Professor, let me just check if Umakant is back. I think he's probably still having some troubles.
Yep.
Yeah, Professor Satya, do you want to?
Yeah. So this time I don't have a good answer. Okay. So my answer is actually a combination of a lot of things. One, a lot of hardship for the first movers. Like for example, if in my case, if Agnikul succeeds, ePlane succeeds, Aerostravilos succeeds, we will be able to showcase through a lot of hard work, trying to scrounge around for cash and so on, what needs to be done. A part of it is already happening. For example, we went through the process of 2 rounds of fundraise, very difficult effort in Agnikul, and now very fortunately the government is now, as of yesterday, for example, ISRO has announced a entity called SEED that will now fund the deep tech space startups. 2 years back we were like, hey, come on, why couldn't we have this here? Right? But that said, the other thing that I would like to point out is I don't really believe in free money at all. I mean, you can get like small amounts of free money to kind of like push you at early stages, like I think what Tasneem was talking about. But in the long run, counting on free money is the wrong thing. You need to be looking for equity money or anything that you will have some kind of a payback or some kind of a strings attached thing, because you need to be accountable, you need to be answerable, right? So that's very, very important for doing this. So the way we do this right now is we want to break out of this mold of a seed round, Series A, Series B, and so on. You want to call it whatever, but I'm not going to go to market anytime soon, right? So I'm not doing a Series A round just to go to market. If you want to call it that, that is fine, but you can have a lot of other names for it. You can say pre-seed, seed, post-seed, pre-series, whatever you want to call it. But I need to keep on raising chunks of small amounts of money, right? This is the approach that you want to do. The problem with that is we always are on a fundraising mode. There is always the founders are always on a fundraising mode. They're not spending time on the tech development. That's an issue, right? So is there a way by which we can change that, have larger chunks of money put in over longer periods of time, kind of thing, right? That's the second aspect. Now, for that to happen, people should actually start having confidence in our tech, right? And that's one of those hugely big problems that we have. I mean, we have so much confidence in what the West can do rather than about ourselves. And this again is something that we will have to change over time, right? And only then, so it's kind of like we have to go through the hump the first few years, unfortunately, before we can stabilize and command respect among investors saying, hey, I have showed you what I can do, just put in the money and then relax. That should be the approach. We are not yet there at all, far from that, but it has to happen. So the last point is the center that I was talking about, which actually produces these startups from ideation onwards, right? That government can help, right? So you can have government actually putting in money of the order of like tens or hundreds of crores in these innovation centers, right? And they don't give money for the startups at all, right? The startups will still have to actually go get money, but you have the ecosystem that is there for them to actually do a quick product development, get all the advice that's required on multiple fronts. That is, if that's actually enabled, that will be great.
Yeah. Okay, so it's good to have you back, Umakant. We took a slight detour and did some other discussion. So do you want to, you were talking about the challenges in the ecosystem, and maybe my next question would be, along with challenges, also tell us about what's working well in this ecosystem. So maybe you can address both, and then we will move to the other two panelists.
Sure. I mean, sorry, I was nipped in the bud by the internet connection being lost here. But yeah, I think it's, I fundamentally feel that, yeah, we need to probably stop doing jugaad, and we need to build this, idea to impact innovation engine for being really Atmanirbhar in some sense, right? I think we need to link our universities with, so the challenge today, I mean, and I'm sure, some of it is now getting addressed a bit, but IITs and ISCs, they were set up for teaching and a bit of research, but the research translation element was actually really missing in our universities. I mean, they were not really hiring for people who could actually translate the research into prototypes or, into products, into companies, right? So we need to build that layer. Till we build that layer, it is very difficult for us to, build a company like Google, which just took in $25 million in venture funding and is now 1 trillion plus in terms of market cap, right? So we need to build what we call as, and we're trying to build one actually prototype of that sort in Art Park, which is getting associated with Indian Institute of Science. Art Park stands for AI and Robotics Technology Park. It is purposefully built for research translation. And then we are building a venture studio, which is associated with it, because as Professor Satya was pointing out, we found out in AI and robotics startups, you need actually 4 things to succeed. You need data, talent, domain, and research. So just by providing space, you'll not actually get these startups to grow up. You need to provide all the 4 elements to come together. And then your startups can probably reach a product market fit. And at that point of time, so you have research universities which have a deep linkage with the research parks. Then you have venture studios which take those prototypes and convert that into product. But then to really build these companies and sustain them over a long period of time, you need venture funds which have a time scale of 12 to 15 years horizon, right? One of the big reasons why the deep life sciences companies aren't coming out, because it takes 15 years. So you have 15-year funds in US and you have 15-year funds in Europe. And you see, I mean, just a tiny nation like Switzerland, and you go to Sweden and you see these interesting companies sprouting up. They're not happening by accident, right? I mean, of course, innovation for us has been associated with, serendipitous outcomes for a long time, but it is actually very systemic, right? So you have to build a system for innovation. Otherwise, we will be only talking about Atmanirbhar, but we will never be actually having autonomy in terms of having access to deep technology. And I think in some areas it has happened. I think in case of like there are brief pockets that are coming up in IIT Madras and IIT Kanpur also, and now ISC is also helping us build this. So I think in next 3 to 4 years we should start to see an alternate model emerge, right? And along with this, if there are areas where government is looking to encourage certain strategic products to come out or technologies to come out, they would have to think about an evergreen venture fund, just like InQtel is there in US, which is a $150 million evergreen fund by CIA. And their dollar to dollar ratio is 1:9. So for every dollar invested, they'll recoup $9, right? And so it is an evergreen fund, 150 million. The size doesn't work because it's an evergreen get filled. And you name any deep tech innovation that has come out of US, they have put money in it, right? And I think that's the right approach, and it can be done professionally. It can co-invest along with the venture funds that are going after some of these areas, and that will also ensure that government also gets access to technology. And one critical thing in all of that is use of government as a customer. So investor is fine, but as a customer, right? So if I look at it, the US government has a buying capacity of $500 billion. I mean, if you really ask me, I mean, SpaceX, I mean, it's all celebrated. Elon Musk comes on the stage and he talks about it. But nobody realizes that they got $4.5 billion in subsidy from the government. They got so much support from the government, right? And, you know, and it is very difficult. It's very difficult unless we turn the buying power of the government, which is probably in the region of $50 to $70 billion per year in India, right? If we enable government to buy innovations, today the government buying process is set up on L1, the lowest cost model, right? So with lowest cost, you can never buy innovation. Innovation always comes at premium, right? So unless we flip that, you know, the whole buying process to say, okay, you can buy innovation. I mean, how are we expecting our government to be innovative and use innovative technologies when we are only structuring them to buy low cost things? And of course, I think they can start by saying, okay, these ecosystems are building up. You know, if you're associated with IIT Madras, ISC, or IIT Kanpur, or some other ecosystems or clusters, right? You're a decent startup, right? You know, and maybe they can start by saying, okay, I'll trial with them, right? So that I'm assured of the quality of the standard of the, you know, stuff coming out. But that could be a beginning. But if we really want these sector to flourish, we have to build this idea to impact engine. And along with that, we need to change the buying process of this government.
Great. What is it that's going well for us? Particularly, you know, talk to us about the talent pipeline that we have in this country, and if and how it actually supports deep tech, you know, ecosystem, and if we are lacking in some form.
Yeah, absolutely. I think talent pipeline is phenomenal. I think the work that IITs have done, and I mean, they've laid the talent pipeline for the whole world. I mean, 15,000, you know, fellow IITians are driving Silicon Valley. You pick up, I mean, Google is headed by one. I mean, you know, so, you know, Microsoft, I mean, you take any major, you know, technology company, right? All the way to IBM, right? I mean, IBM is our fellow, you know, IIT Kanpur alumni. So I think the talent part is phenomenal. I think there is no doubt, right? We have it in plenty, right? And I think, so unfortunately, the problem with plenty, when you talk to countries like Canada and Sweden, which are trying to attract talent, then you realize, oh, you have so much talent, and that is a great part. I think we have entrepreneurs which, you know, which are phenomenal, right? Like, who could probably grow, you know, they're literally growing, sugarcane crops in desert, if I were to put that metaphor, right? I think in business model innovation, Indians are way more creative. I've interacted with startups in other countries, in US, in Europe, and Canada, and I was like, you know, they're no match for Indian entrepreneurs. If we can give such entrepreneurs this kind of a deep tech innovation engine or ecosystem, you know, we would really, you know, leapfrog into, you know, what we are supposed to be, right? Like, there is a report out which says that India and China will be the center of tech revolution by 2035, right? But it won't happen by itself. I think we would have to take these concrete steps. So we have all the raw ingredients, but we need to have the recipe and, you know, the discipline to follow that recipe to the end to get the end product out. Yeah.
We need the structures and the processes. Absolutely. Yeah. Thoughts on talent, and Taslim, how does that play out in the life sciences area? How does the talent equation play out?
Yeah, so I think combine your previous question in terms of what's going good for us, right? Yeah. And adding the talent part to it. I think definitely very exciting. So when I say deep tech, and not possibly only take life sciences, but deep tech, yes, very exciting. We have a very smart, you know, talent pool which has come through, and which have now the curiosity to address problems around them. I am a strong believer that I think going forward, we'll have to build our own solutions. Even though pneumonia or any other aspect you want to take, a simple blood test or anything, agri you want to take, on the first layer of it, globally, it is possibly same. You go 2 layers down, there are details which are different. the same solutions do not work. Multinational corporates, which are building some of the devices, may not work in many parts of India. What it says, there are indigenous local problems which are not exactly aligned with global solutions, which would require indigenous solutions going forward. And that's why our talent pool, which is keen, which is passionate, which is looking around and able to build responses to that, build solutions to it, is going to be the key for us if we actually nurture them better. I think that will be very, very important, because a lot of it, as one would say in healthcare, or even in agri, one of the first thing that people will talk about is affordability, right? Quality is one, but you have to be in affordability in somewhere so that people can actually provide a healthcare. So talent pool is there, and there are passionate people and engineers. I may say that possibly in true biological sciences, which is more of a molecular biology and so on, possibly we will require more people to actually again be, taken to that. That is where there's a requirement for people to take a plunge in biotech. What we are seeing is a larger strength of engineers, real smart engineers building biotech tools or medtech tools and so on. What we are not at the same ratio seeing is the pure, true blue biological scientists actually taking that plunge. So I think that movement has to happen, and that we should actually encourage that aspect. But what is going good for us is that there is a belief in the system that people are actually building. They are actually challenging Baxters of the world, devices from the Baxter, Philips, Bosch, J&J, you name them. And these are the guys who are coming from design engineering or mechanical engineering, putting together with strong dreams and so on. So that's a good part about it. What we need to make sure is that the journey gets supported through the way, so that we actually do not let them down during the journey. So I would say that.
Okay. Mr. Satya, your thoughts on what's going well?
Right. So in 2018 March, I actually was traveling to France as part of a FICCI delegation representing Agnikul as a space startup to attend the Paris Space Week. And FICCI had actually organized visits to Ariane groups. They make the rockets, and then Airbus making the spacecraft and all of that prior to the Space Week itself. And one of the things that I immediately realized was there was a huge amount of credibility associated with India in the space sector going outside. So everybody actually took serious attention to what I had to say, and the fact that we were making these rockets and stuff. And the entire business model of what we were trying to do, making a rocket within a week with no waiting time for a satellite, having a flat cost curve, all of that stuff that we were talking about. They took it extremely seriously for a couple of reasons. One is ISRO has established that kind of a reputation for us outside, and that's something that we definitely, that's what I also say. If you actually are spending a lot of time getting space startups to succeed because we can ride over the ISRO bandwagon and the reputation, and go outside and win laurels for ourselves, a lot of other deep tech startups will get motivated to do things because, hey, we can make rockets, we can make a lot of other things, would be the idea, right? So then suddenly everybody will feel that, yes, we can actually do a lot of deep tech. So this is something that's very, very good going for us, is what I found. And on the ground, when we come back, we could actually tap into a lot of ex-ISRO scientists and also start talking to ISRO players, again, because of IIT Madras connects that we had and so on. So that is something that we could push. This is now actually, the tide has turned completely to our favor with this pandemic because of this Atmanirbhar Bharat, where all this in space and seed, all of those things are coming. The government is now coming overboard and trying to support this in many ways. And launching is now permitted. A lot of these things have changed in the last 6 months. So all these things are actually going good for us. Similarly, you can see that there's a lot of buzz in the drone space, maybe pun intended. The gap in between, like for example, for aviation, right? So between rockets and on the one side and drones on the other side, there is still a lot of airspace, again, pun intended, I guess, that needs to be covered. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know that we have all the sort of ingredients in place, the talent. We have a lot of goodwill going outside the country as well. And we do have, I believe, as you pointed out, in ISRO, for this particular space, we have a very large organization with a lot of experience and credibility, I would imagine. And Taslim, you would say that even with the life sciences, I guess we have a lot of biotech companies, pharmaceutical companies. So do you see them? What role do you see them playing in this deep tech ecosystem? The larger life science companies.
So you mean the largest life science companies?
Yeah, I mean, because you have the startups, but then what is the role of the larger players in nurturing that ecosystem, right? Like an ISRO, what an ISRO is doing for Agnikul. What is the parallel in your space?
No, I think one thing that definitely is very important is that for long gestation and life sciences, where I always see that as a baton race, where you have different players having different expertise. And if you see in life sciences, including medical devices, which actually leads to digital tech, digital health and so on, there is a clear movement where the mid-sized companies like biotechs, as you call them there, and then they work with pharma companies and then so on and so forth. So there is a pattern that happens where expertise is there, risk takers are there, risk mitigators are there, clinical trials happens and so on. There's a very good pipeline, and they actually coexist and co-reside at many places. Largely many times, just like around UCSF, they're right next door, next road and so on. So there's a lot of proximity that is there. I think that's the role that in India, pharmaceutical industry needs to play as well, or the larger medtech medical device industry needs to play as well, where the R&D development has to happen together, where the incoming of the technology doesn't need to come from the headquarters in Europe or happen in one place of Bangalore. It can happen with outside, and that can be taken in and taken forward. So there is a coexistent dialogues that have to happen. I think early things have happened, but I would be honest and say that this is not very large number. I think we need it more.
Okay.
I'll just possibly conclude on this point by saying is that what this in terms of the deep tech, what can be done is that a lot of new kind of drug discovery is actually going to happen more on a tech basis now, data driven. Because traditionally, because you mentioned it, traditionally the drug discovery used to take long amount of time, a lot of hard work with so many molecules being tested for thousands of criteria. Now, a lot of this, because data is available, can be done in very, very short time. And hence there will be a combination of those tech capabilities plus pharmaceutical companies or even medical devices that can actually be very interesting. So I just thought I'll add to that point that could be also an interesting convergence. This is already happening in many parts of the world and could happen right here.
So I guess, yeah, it is happening, but I think in India and this ecosystem, we need to see that that open innovation piece open up a lot more in at least the life sciences area, where the larger players are opening up their innovation chain to the smaller players and integrating, with startups sort of in a seamless manner. Umakant, any thoughts on that from your end? The role of larger companies, Indian companies in particular, or even let's say multinational companies.
Yeah, I think one of the fantastic things that's actually happening out there is this rollout of NMICP, a cyber-physical mission by Department of Science and Technology, which is actually rolling out close to $500 million of investment into setting up these kind of research parks, right? And I think this is a fantastic opportunity because, like in Art Park, we are basically, setting it up in a triple helix model where you have the global industry can come together, academia can come together, and government can also come together, right? And I think that's a very exciting place for a lot of these large companies to come in and, working closely with this ecosystem, not just with just the startups, because fundamentally, I was in a large company for a long time. I've seen innovators' dilemma is there for all the large companies. I mean, they cannot, it's a systemic thing and it's very hard. It's very hard to get by. But then there are examples of, companies like Cisco, companies that have actually stayed the course for a long period of time. So if you look at companies which actually have been able to, create a much longer longevity cycles, they have actually resorted to growing innovation outside and buying innovation outside.
Yeah.
So I think large companies should not think of startups as competition, but they should actually think of them as their survival packages, right? Which is, probably experiments that they can't run themselves, but a startup can run, right? I mean, you cannot tamper with your core technology, foundation, but a startup can. You cannot tamper with your core business model innovation, but a startup can, right? So why not join in, in a way where you're not smoothing the startup with the, bureaucratic setups that you might have inside, which were built for a different DNA. So, it looks bureaucratic because it's built for a different DNA, right? But I think these places are going to be very interesting and exciting. So the art park that we're setting up, we're inviting industry to join hands, and they can join in, with very little monetary contribution. They can also come and play a strategic part, and it's being done in a public-private model, so they can also shape it. So I think this Atmanirbhar story will truly get shaped not just by the government, but also by the large companies that are already there. They have scale of manufacturing, they have scale of marketing, sales, distribution. So if they can actually join in this innovation pipeline, just as like Professor Satya was talking about ISRO, playing a game-changing role in terms of how the startups are accepted, how they are viewed, and just being the torchbearer in this, in this whole, revolution that we want to see. I think that they will be phenomenal.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think that was fantastic. We've covered a lot of ground. So in the remaining 15 minutes, I want to just go through a few audience questions that have been posted here. Maybe some of them may have been answered through the course of the conversation, so I might skip some of them. Shrikala is asking a question, and I think she has two questions, both related to electronic health record systems, right? What is the scope for EHR companies and AI incorporation with health tech, right? And there is a problem of adoptability. Hospitals are happy with their own EHR systems. How do you overcome this? Does the National Health Mission Card plan from Government of India help this, or is there no scope for private startups in EHR environment? So I guess that's something that both Umakant and Taslim, you could probably give it a shot.
Sure. I think fundamentally, if I look at, right, if I take a look at a long-term view, right, there will be more robots doing surgeries by 2040 than doctors. Okay, and the whole healthcare model is going to go from event-based, intervention-based approach to prevention-based approach, right? And that's a long-term view, right? 15-20 years. That's a major flip that's going to happen. So I think the big challenge is that a lot of startups go into these red ocean areas, right? Which are, which we have a lot of competition. Their innovation is more like a feature than truly like a product that can help them leapfrog into new areas, right? So I would strongly encourage, them to think from that perspective that, okay, how is this tying into this larger change that's actually going to happen? Because if you can, then you can actually, stitch the story backward and sell that story that, yes, I see that this is a big change that's going to happen, right? If robotic surgery is going to be the way for us to make surgery accessible to every single person, be in the city or in a small village, maybe that's the way to go. And what would actually enable that kind of a change to happen? Like yesterday I was talking to somebody and I was telling that, we might have knee as a service model, right? Like I actually get a knee implanted and, I pay for it as I use it and as I, it wears out. And so not only the technology innovation is going to happen, but also business model innovation is also happening. So I think that is where, if you can pivot your startup, look at it from that perspective, you might actually find that adoption might become a lot more easier.
Okay. Taslim, you want to add or shall we move on?
I think I'll just quickly add, I think Umakant has covered very well. I would say that definitely because of the complex and fragmented, status of the healthcare system, it is going to be difficult. But I think it's great opportunity for a really good technology to actually go in and cover the market. So I would see this as an opportunity despite of the problems that it has. And once you are in there, I think it will be there. So I think we are on that path with National Health Mission and many more things happening. There's a huge opportunity. Several people are actually attempting that. There might be 100 startups that actually, if we call for, they will be applying for it with the ready product. So the key is going to be amazing product, but I think an efficient implementation of capturing the market will be the key here.
Okay, so we have a question here for Professor Satya asking, can origami play a major role in design of space tech?
Yeah, I saw that question. Not sure about it entirely because I'm not an origami specialist. So I don't know exactly what all is possible. But I guess the question there is all about imagining prototypes in 3D. And I think if somebody is really good at origami, maybe they can actually do that. But I'm not sure because I'm not a specialist in that. But what typically happens today is we now have very good engineering drawing software, which allows us to visualize things in 3D on the computer and then you can do a lot of cut sections and different orientations and all of that stuff. So there's a lot of, so people used to do, for example, in design, they used to do clay modeling in order to be able to do this and then do a laser profiling and so on. Something similar could be done with origami, but all of that is actually getting replaced with engineering drawing and engineering graphics becoming 3D. So I think going forward, we will probably look at holograms and all that, and AR, VR, right? So that's the other thing. So is it possible for us to actually create a virtual reality and move around an object in reality to see in different ways, or to turn it around, take cuts, all of that stuff virtually? I think that's the direction in which things are emerging to the extent I can see.
Okay, so now we'll take the question from Deepak, who's asking, again, going back to the funding, we talked about it a little, we talked about it quite a bit, but if there's anything else we'd like to add here, I'll just read the question. It's like, why would investors invest in deep tech? Is it revenue alone that they would be interested in, or also the technological innovation and social impact? I mean, I guess what he's asking is, what is the profile of a typical investor of deep tech?
Hey, let some crazy guys be there as investors. I mean, what's the problem?
Yeah, just to add, I think, so fundamentally the people who might be interested in investing in deep tech are the guys who are thinking that technology will scale exponentially, right? Technology is the only thing which actually scales exponentially. Ops and marketing, they scale linearly, right? So if I were to look at, take a step back and look at, right, like, Google is a classic example, took in 25 million and it is a $1 trillion valuation. Whereas we have companies, and the e-commerce company, they take a lot of money, but they're at a multiple of 3x or 4x when they get sold, right? Versus this, which could be at 120 to 300 or 400, 500x. So yes, as Professor Satya was pointing out, I mean, there would be those crazy guys who would be thinking, okay, I want to take that chance that this could become 300x or 400x, right? And so that is there. I mean, just on a general approach to figuring out financing for deep tech, I would suggest that if you're able to, if you're thinking about it, the whole company lifecycle approach, right? Till the time you prove the science and prove the tech, right? You might want to fund it with grants, and you might have to be a little hungry about figuring out what grants could work, or maybe I could embed myself in some of these research parks that are coming up, and and then I'm able to build this company out so that it has a strong technology foundation that can actually, when I go out into the market, the investor can see that yes, now the technology is in a shape where it can scale exponentially, and then you're going to get really good investors who will come along with you and they will be there for a long haul. What I see most often happens is that when you have a deep tech idea, and I have also made the same mistake. You go in with angel investors and they run with you for some time, but then they see that, okay, this is complex, this is rocket science, right? And it is going to take time, right? It is going to take time to mature it, and and then they might get fidgety and they might want you to pivot. And as Dr. Tasleem Sharif was pointing out, that then they're like, okay, the deep tech part comes down, and then you become like a servicing of a company or something like that, right? So that innovation dilution can happen, right? So you'd have to decide, right? If I'm looking at building a long-term company approach, then you might have to be a little bit more, innovative in your early funding models, and look around. There are grants available. There are ways in which you can actually do it with much lower amount of risk till you reduce the technology risk, so that you have a much higher chance of an investor coming along for a long ride. Yeah.
Okay, shall we move to the next question? I think Geoffrey Thomas has a question more about, how do we provide positive reinforcement for people who are working in this space? What kind of media support, to celebrate innovation in early stages? So how are we thinking about it? What is necessary? Do we have enough of it? Comments on that, please. Tasleem, you want to go? Okay, Professor Satya, please.
I mean, just had a quick thought that we are, at least in the aerospace sector, it's a bit too early. Unless we actually see like one cycle of a set of startups actually going commercial and making money, true kind of celebration may not really happen. All the celebration that we are actually going through many times, get awards, Economic Times awards or whatever it is, they're all nice. Media celebrating things and all those things is fine. But the proof of the pudding is actually in these startups making money. And we will have to wait it out until they patiently go through their process. So we are still a few more years away before we can start jumping around.
Okay.
I can add quickly. I think in the field, like in the life sciences, which includes all healthcare, agri, and so on, I think sharing exciting work and celebrating good work and showcasing role models is a very important thing. When especially if you have an issue of people not attempting deep risky stuff, I think it's very important for actually to see that there is success. There could be definitely, you have to, balance it with not overdoing that aspect. But I think those stories are very important in medias, like online media, like places like, Shraddha Sharma's Your Story and others actually encompass some of the very good stories in which comes out. And I think these are very important because there are many aspirants, not only in the top tier towns, but also in many other places. And this media allows them to read that, understand, and build dreams, which is important. Traditionally, we have built dreams for salaried jobs, very safe aspects, and so on. I think the stories would allow them to see that there are opportunities otherwise also to achieve what they want to achieve. So it's a kind of dissemination of those stories is also very important, so that we can have more and more people aspire to be there. So I think for that angle, I would say that it's very important to actually build that up, but with balance built into that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, my father was a professor, and and I come from academic family, and yeah. So entrepreneurship would have not been possible till I was able to show him the example of Narayan Murthy, and and then his father was also a teacher, and he did create a large company, and it was important for me to convince my father to say, okay, it's okay, you can try this out. Of course. It was still tough, right? I mean, getting married is a tough event in lives of so many entrepreneurs, and I still come across. I counsel them, and that yes, but I think gradually, post Flipkart exit, things became a little bit better. I mean, of course, they should have, probably continued it. I think it would have been even better. But I think it just brought to, the front the whole idea of role models, right? Like, people are looking at, okay, this is possible. You might be coming from middle class, but then you can build a business using technology and you can, get somewhere, right? So I think on that front, the media stories are important. I think it's an important dimension. Asian cultures, do not look upon, the self-publicity or publicity with that much enthusiasm as, probably US culture does. But yeah, I think we'd have to probably adopt that in moderation. I think there is some, for building the whole talent pipeline, I think it is important. I think people, when I go back to IIT Kanpur, they are considering, entrepreneurship as an option. They are thinking about it. I think, and that's a great, that's a great sign for a nation like India, which is looking to, have, this whole Atmanirbhar approach to developing technology. And it also is important if we want these young minds to solve the problems that they see around themselves. I think. So I think I see this as a positive approach. I think we probably need more of it. I completely agree. Maybe Rajnikant should make a movie about it. I think then it will get more mainstream edition. But I will just end with a story. I mean, I remember I actually went and spoke on Doordarshan at the invitation of Niti Aayog, and we had Ramesh Shaskar also coming in from MIT. And, this was the first time I was talking about artificial intelligence in Hindi, right? And we struggled. I mean, we could not figure out how to describe artificial intelligence in Hindi. But then, 2 weeks down the line, I met somebody who said that, this was very interesting because it allowed me to think about, applying, AI to my business, whether he applies it or not. But, just the thinking process that got started. And I was like, yeah, that is actually very important, that the role of mainstream media in letting people think about the possibility itself is a big task. So of course, if some of our friends go out and make movies about some of the stuff, maybe building rockets, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to excite people. Definitely, probably it's going to excite my kids.
Great. So we are all out on time. So there are a couple other questions, but they are more specific. I think they want information about the art park, the AI park, and in another case, I think it's about Professor Satya, your lab at IIT Madras. So I would encourage the people who have asked these questions to reach out. I'm sure the emails IDs are available on the web. If that's okay with you all, maybe 1 or 2 questions on email. Yeah. So please do that. We are out on time, so we'll have to wrap up at this point. I want to thank all the panelists one more time for taking the time to be here. It was a very, very insightful discussion. A lot of green shoots, and at the same time, I think we have long ways to go. So hopefully we can synthesize all of this nicely into a report where we can come up with some useful insights both for practitioners and policymakers. So thank you all once again. And of course, thank you audience for being patient and staying through this session.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thanks a lot.
Wonderful moderation. Thank you.